The wind in Drywater had a taste. It was the taste of salt from the flats to the west and of dust from the baked earth all around. It scoured the unpainted boards of the buildings and polished the bones of cattle that had given up long ago. At dawn, this wind was a cool whisper, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the lonely caw of crows circling over fields burned brown by a summer that had arrived too early. June Mercy Harper felt that whisper on her chapped cheeks as she hauled 2 buckets of water from the town well back to the Silver Comet boarding house. The weight of the yoke across her shoulders was a familiar ache, as was the sting of the rough-hewn wood against the cracked skin of her hands. At 26, her hands looked twice her age, a roadmap of lye soap, scalding water, and endless mending. She moved with a steady, practiced rhythm, her gaze fixed on the rutted track of the stagecoach road, the main artery of a town that often felt like it was dying of thirst. Her world was one of quiet labor, a life lived in the background, noticed only when a meal was late or a shirt was not starched to a man's liking. As she wrestled the buckets through the kitchen door, a rider passed on the road, tall and straight in the saddle. Cole Ashford did not look at the boarding house. He rarely looked at much in town, his focus always on his business. He rode a powerful buckskin, its coat the color of honey, and led a mule loaded with canvas sacks of salt from his small mine. He was headed for May Lynn's mercantile to trade the salt for seed and supplies. Cole moved like the land he owned vast, quiet, and governed by seasons and scents. His face, weathered by the sun and set in a permanent calm, gave little away. He was 38. A man who had built a small empire of cattle, land, and trade routes out of rock and sorrow. The town knew he was rich, but his wealth was like his character, a private thing, not for show. Later that morning, June was wiping down the long table in the saloon connected to the boarding house, the air thick with the ghosts of last night's whiskey and stale cigar smoke. 2 cattle hands, nursing morning beers, were talking loud enough to be heard over the sweep of her rag. "Heard Ashford's expanding his herd again," one said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice that just missed the spittoon. "More work for us, I suppose," the other grumbled. "Man's all work, that one. Buried himself out on that ranch since his brother passed. Needs a wife to soften him." The first man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Who'd he take, Violet LaRue? She'd faint at the sight of a cow? No, a man like that. He's set in his ways, not like some folks. Take that Harper girl, for instance. He nodded his head in June's direction, not bothering to lower his voice. She'll likely die alone, right here in this dustbin. Too plain, too quiet. June's hand did not stop its circular motion on the sticky wood. A flush of heat crept up her neck, a familiar burn she had learned to ignore, or at least pretend to. She had been hearing variations of that pronouncement for years. She was the forgotten leaf on the family tree, the one left to wither on the branch. She forced the corners of her mouth to lift in a small, polite smile as she moved away from their table, a gesture of dismissal that cost her more than they could ever know. The pain was an old companion, a stone she carried in her pocket, its edges worn smooth by constant handling. She was in the laundry room, her arms deep in a tub of hot, sudsy water, when Harlan Garrett came in. The owner of the Silver Comet moved with a soft step that always seemed to take people by surprise. He was a man of shadows and whispers, his smile a thin, damp thing. He held a piece of paper in his hand as if it were a rare jewel. "June," he said, his voice oozing a false warmth that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "A message for you, all the way from Cheyenne." She dried her raw hands on her apron and took the telegram. It was an official-looking document, the printed letters stark and important. Her heart gave a strange, uncertain thump. No one ever sent her a telegram. She read the words, and then read them again, her mind struggling to make sense of them. Bride June Harper, chosen for rancher Cole Ashford. Per his proposal, travel to Twin Spurs Ranch at once. She looked up at Garrett, her brow furrowed in confusion. I do not understand. There must be some mistake. Garrett chuckled, a low, oily sound. No mistake. Girl, it's a mail-order arrangement. Quite common these days. A man like Mr. Ashford. He's too busy to do his own courting. He sent a request, described what he wanted in a wife, and the agency in Cheyenne matched him with you. Your name must have been put forward by someone. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of licorice. He's paid the agency fee already, a substantial sum. I hear you are a very lucky woman, a rich cowboy like that. Choosing you, he must want someone sensible, not one of these flighty town girls. The world seemed to tilt under June's feet. Cole Ashford, the quiet, powerful man who owned half the county. It was impossible. A dream, a cruel joke. And yet the paper was real. The words were there. A tiny, fragile seed of hope, something she had thought long dead, began to sprout in the barren soil of her heart. To have a home, to belong somewhere, to be chosen. You must go now. June, Garrett pressed, his eyes gleaming. The stage does not run out his way. You will have to walk or hire a buggy, and you cannot keep a man like that waiting. An opportunity like this, it will not come again. Pack your things. I will let you go without notice, as a kindness. His kindness felt like a shove. June looked around the steamy, cramped laundry room, at the endless piles of dirty linen, at the cracked walls of her world. Then she looked at the telegram again. Her life was a stagnant pool. This was a stone tossed into it, sending ripples out to an unknown shore. What if it was true, but what if it was a mistake? The thought of facing Cole Ashford, of him laughing at her, was terrifying. Yet the thought of staying, of listening to the whispers and growing old in this dim, lonely place, was worse. Garrett's insistent gaze felt like a cage closing around her. The decision was not really a decision at all. It was an escape. While June was packing her few belongings into a worn carpet bag, Cole Ashford was leaning against the counter at the Mercantile, finalizing his order with May Lynn. The small, sharp-eyed woman slid a sack of pinto beans toward him. "That everything for you today, Cole?" she asked. "Just the grain seed, and I will take a bolt of that sturdy blue canvas." As May Lynn measured the canvas, Eli Monroe shuffled in. Eli was a man who lived on the edges of things, a friend from Cole's younger, wilder days, now the town's telegraph operator. He avoided Cole's eyes. "Afternoon. Cole," Eli mumbled, heading for the pickle barrel. A rancher named Peterson, waiting his turn, clapped Cole on the shoulder. "Well, Ashford, you are full of surprises. Heard you are getting a mail-order bride. The Harper girl from the boarding house never pictured you for the type." Cole went very still. He turned slowly from the counter, his calm face hardening into a mask of disbelief. "What did you say?" Peterson, realizing his mistake from the cold fire in Cole's eyes, took a step back. "Just town talk. You know how it is. Eli's been telling folks about a telegram." Cole's gaze swung to Eli, who suddenly seemed fascinated by a crack in the floorboards. Eli Cole's voice was low, but it cut through the quiet store like a razor. Eli swallowed hard. "Just a message. Cole came through this morning, from Cheyenne, said you'd chosen her." "I have done no such thing," Cole said, each word a chip of ice. "I have sent no telegram. I have not requested a bride. That is a lie." He looked from Eli's pale, sweating face to Peterson's nervous one. His honor, the one thing he valued more than his land, was being dragged through the town's gossip like a dirty rope. A quiet, deep anger began to smolder inside him. He paid May Lynn for his goods, his movements stiff and precise, and walked out of the Mercantile without another word, leaving a heavy silence behind him. The walk to the Twin Spurs Ranch was long, the sun a hammer in the brassy sky. With every step, June's fragile hope battled with a rising tide of fear. The carpet-bag grew heavier, and the fancy of a new life began to seem as distant and unreal as the shimmering heat haze on the horizon. What was she doing? A plain, poor servant girl marching up to the biggest ranch in the territory to announce herself as the chosen bride of a man who did not even know her name. The absurdity of it washed over her, and she had to stop and lean against a juniper tree, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was a fool. Garrett had made a fool of her. The town would laugh louder than ever. But she could not go back. To return to the Silver Comet would be to admit defeat, to hand Harlan Garrett a victory, to confirm every cruel whisper about her. So she straightened her shoulders, wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, and kept walking. She saw the ranch before she reached it, a collection of sturdy, well-kept buildings nestled in a cottonwood grove, an oasis of green in the parched land. A windmill turned slowly, pumping life-giving water into a large trough. It was a place of order, of purpose. It was a home. A boy, no older than 12, was mending a fence near the main house. He looked up as she approached, his expression wary. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, clutching a pair of pliers. "I am here to see Mr. Ashford," June said, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is June Harper." Before the boy could answer, the door of the ranch house opened and Cole Ashford stepped out onto the porch. He was taller than she had realized, broader in the shoulders. He looked from her dusty, travel-worn figure to the carpetbag in her hand, and his face, already grim, settled into hard lines. June's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt small and foolish, an unwelcome weed in this well-tended garden. He walked down the steps and stopped a few feet from her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held no welcome. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice quiet and steady, "there has been a terrible mistake." He held up a hand as she started to fumble in her purse for the telegram. "I know what the message said. I heard it in town. But I need you to know the truth of it." He took a deep breath, his gaze direct and unwavering. "I never sent any letter. I never sent that telegram." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. The last, flickering ember of hope was extinguished, leaving only cold, gray ash. She stood there, mute and shaking, the dusty wind whipping a loose strand of hair across her face. And as the terrible truth of her situation settled upon her, the wind itself seemed to change. It shifted from the south, growing stronger, carrying a different taste now, the taste of grit and sand. On the far western horizon, the clear blue sky was being devoured by a rising wall of brown. A dust storm, vast and angry, was bearing down on them. The air grew thick and heavy, the color of old brass. Cole Ashford did not waste a second on words. His gaze shot past June to the monstrous, churning cloud that was swallowing the sky. It was not a cloud of water, but of earth, a moving mountain of sand and topsoil ripped from the plains. "Tom!" he yelled, his voice a sharp crack in the rising howl of the wind. "The barn doors! Now!" The boy, little Tom, dropped his pliers and sprinted toward the massive structure, his small frame leaning into the gale. Cole grabbed June's arm, his grip firm but not harsh. "Inside the house. Stay away from the windows." He did not wait for an answer, already turning to follow Tom, his long strides eating up the ground. The world had shrunk to a simple, brutal equation of survival. There was no time for shame or explanations. June hesitated for only a heartbeat, the carpetbag falling from her numb fingers. Then, instinct took over, the ingrained knowledge of a life spent reacting to crises, big and small. She ran, not for the house, but for the barn, her skirt whipping around her legs. The wind tore at her hair, pulling pins loose, and flung grit into her eyes, making them water. She reached the barn just as Cole and Tom were wrestling with the first of the huge wooden doors. The wind was a solid thing now, a giant's hand pushing against them. "I can help," she shouted over the roar. Cole gave her a sharp, assessing look, then nodded. "Take this side with Tom. Push on my count. 1, 2, 3. Push." They threw their combined weight against the door. It groaned, scraped along its track, and finally slammed shut. They fumbled with the heavy crossbar, their fingers clumsy in the growing gloom. As they fought with the second door, a new sound joined the storm's chorus. A high, panicked bleating from a nearby pen. A newborn calf, separated from its mother, was staggering in terror, its spindly legs buckling. "Get the door," Cole commanded. "I will get the calf." He vaulted the fence as June and Tom put their shoulders to the wood. The air was a blinding, stinging fog of dust. June could barely see Tom beside her. They managed to close the second door just as the full fury of the storm hit. Darkness fell like a dropped curtain. The barn timbers groaned and the roof shrieked as if it were being torn apart. A moment later, Cole stumbled back inside, a trembling, dust-caked bundle in his arms. He set the calf down in a clean stall, and it immediately collapsed into the straw. "Bolt the small door," he yelled to June, his voice muffled by the bandana he had pulled over his face. June found the bolt and slid it home, the solid chunk of metal a small comfort against the chaos outside. For the next hour, they worked in the maelstrom. They checked latches, reinforced a loose section of the wall with rope and spare lumber, and calmed the nervous horses. June moved with a quiet efficiency that surprised Cole. She did not complain or panic. She saw what needed to be done and did it, her movements economical and sure. She and Tom stretched a heavy canvas tarp over the chicken coop's exposed side, the wind nearly ripping it from their grasp before Cole could help them anchor it with heavy stones. When there was nothing left to do but wait, they retreated to the house. The inside was a dim, hazy world of its own. A fine layer of dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with it. The windows rattled in their frames, and the constant, high-pitched whistle of the wind was a nerve-shredding lament. Little Tom, his face streaked with dirt, coughed and wiped his eyes. "Never seen one come on so fast." "The sky has been yellow for days," Cole said, stripping off his dusty gloves. He looked at June, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for your help. Miss Harper, you can wash up at the basin." The formality of his words was strange, a stark contrast to the life-and-death struggle they had just shared. Humiliation, momentarily forgotten, washed over June again. She was an intruder, a problem to be dealt with once the storm passed. She washed her face and hands, the cool water a small blessing. The house was simple, clean, and masculine. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by shelves filled with books. The furniture was sturdy, built of dark wood, and the floors were bare planks, scrubbed clean. There was a profound stillness to the place, the quiet of a life lived alone. As the afternoon wore on, the storm raged without pause. The relentless noise and confinement created a strange intimacy. Hunger began to gnaw at them. Tom looked hopefully from Cole to June. "I can make something," June offered quietly. "If you have flour, cornmeal." Cole nodded toward the pantry. "Help yourself. Tom, bring in more wood for the stove." June found the kitchen to be as orderly as the rest of the house. She moved with familiar ease, tying her apron and sifting cornmeal into a large bowl. The simple, domestic act grounded her. Here, at least, she knew what to do. Her hands, so often a source of shame for their roughness, were skillful as they mixed the batter for cornbread. The smell of it baking soon filled the small house, a warm, comforting scent that pushed back against the storm's desolation. While she cooked, Cole worked at the table, meticulously disassembling and oiling a squeaky door hinge he had removed earlier. He worked with the same focused intensity he had shown in the barn, his large hands surprisingly deft. Little Tom sat on the floor, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird, and told them stories about the wolf pack that sometimes came down from the mountains in winter. "Cole says you do not shoot a wolf unless it's after the cattle," Tom said, his small knife moving with care. "He says they have their own place, just like we do." June glanced at Cole. He was a man of principles, it seemed, even when it came to the predators that threatened his livelihood. He did not look up from his work, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep-seated respect for the harsh laws of the wild. They ate the cornbread with molasses and thick slices of bacon June had found in the smokehouse. They ate in near silence. The only sounds, the scrape of forks on plates and the unending scream of the wind. The food was simple, but to June, it felt like a feast. It was the first meal she had ever prepared in a home that was not her place of employment. After they had cleared the table, a heavy quiet settled over the room again. To break it, June took the telegram from her purse. The paper was limp and dusty now. She smoothed it out on the table, her gaze tracing the printed letters that had sent her on this impossible journey. As she stared at it, something caught her eye, a faint pattern in the paper itself, visible when she held it up to the lamplight. It was a watermark, a small, elegant letter M inside a circle. "What is it?" Cole asked, noticing her fixed expression. "The paper," she said, her voice filled with a dawning realization. "This watermark, I've seen it before. Mrs. May Lynn at the Mercantile. She uses a special stationery for telegrams and important letters. It is the only place in Drywater you can get it." She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "This telegram did not come from Cheyenne. Mr. Ashford. It may have been routed through there, but the paper it was printed on came from town. Someone in Drywater sent this." Cole took the paper and examined it. He held it to the light, his jaw tightening. The lie was not just a lie, it was a local one, a betrayal from within his own community. The implications of that settled heavily in the room. This was not a random mistake by a distant agency. It was a deliberate, malicious act. Later that night, the storm's fury began to subside, the roar diminishing to a low, mournful moan. They sat before the fire, the flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Tom was asleep on a pallet of blankets in the corner. "I should not have come," June said softly, staring into the flames. "I should have known it was too good to be true." "It was not your fault," Cole said, his voice a low rumble. "You were deceived." "It is what everyone expects of me," she continued, the words coming out in a rush, a dam of held-back bitterness finally breaking. The plain girl, the old maid, so desperate she would believe any foolish story. They must be having a fine laugh about it in town. "Let them laugh," Cole said, his tone hard. "The opinions of fools are worth less than the dust blowing outside. But my name, my honor is not something to be played with." He fell silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "This ranch can be a lonely place. After my brother, I learned to prefer it that way. Trust is a rare commodity out here. Miss Harper, I have found it is safer to rely on the seasons and the good sense of a horse than on the words of most men." June looked at him then, and for the first time, she saw past the wealthy landowner, past the formidable reputation. She saw a man encased in a solitude as profound as her own, though his was built of grief and choice, while hers was built of poverty and neglect. He was watching her, his gaze intent. He had seen her work, had seen her calm in the face of the storm. He was looking at her. She realized, not as the town saw her, but as the person who had stood beside him and fought for this small patch of order against the chaos of the wild. "We have to find out who did this," she said, her voice gaining a strength she did not know she possessed. "We cannot let them get away with it. This person, whoever it is, they used your name to hurt me, and they used my hope to damage your honor. We should go to the telegraph office. We should question Eli Monroe." Cole stared into the fire, his hands resting on his knees. He was a private man, and the thought of stirring up more gossip, of becoming the center of a town scandal, was deeply repellent to him. To start an investigation would be to fan the flames of the very rumors he despised. It would mean facing the smirks and whispers head on. He could just send her back to town in the morning, let the talk die down, and retreat back into his fortress of solitude. It would be the easier path. But then he looked at June. at the quiet resolve in her face, and he knew it would not be the right one. The wind had finally died. A profound silence fell over the land. The storm was over. The next morning, the world outside was a strange, new landscape. Everything was coated in a smooth, fine layer of reddish-brown dust. The air was clean and sharp. As Cole stepped off the porch to inspect the damage, he stopped abruptly. There, in the soft dust near the path leading to his salt storage shed, were two sets of footprints. They were not his, they were not Tom's, and they were not June's. The boot heels were worn down in a distinctive, uneven pattern. Someone had been out here last night, or in the very early hours of the morning, using the cover of the storm to move around his ranch, unseen. They had been very interested in his salt shed. The ride back to Drywater was a silent affair. Cole had hitched a wagon, loading his supplies and providing a seat for June, a tacit acknowledgement that she was, for now, under his protection. He rode his buckskin alongside. The town, freshly washed by the passing storm, seemed to hold its breath as they came down the main road. Curtains twitched in windows. Men stopped their conversations on the boardwalk to stare. Every eye was on them, a collective gaze of suspicion and salacious curiosity. June kept her back straight and her eyes fixed forward, but she could feel the heat of their stares like a brand as they drew up in front of the mercantile. A small procession of the town's more prosperous ladies turned the corner. At their lead was Violet LaRue, the banker's daughter, dressed in a confection of pale blue muslin that seemed absurdly out of place in the dusty street. Her beauty was like her dress, perfect and untouchable, and her smile was a weapon she wielded with expert precision. She paused, making a great show of surprise. "Why, Mr. Ashford and Miss Harper, I see you both survived the storm." Her eyes swept over June's simple, travel-worn dress and then back to Cole's grim face. "It must have been quite an ordeal. I do hope you were not too terribly inconvenienced." The word hung in the air, weighted with insinuation. The women with her tittered behind their gloved hands. "We managed," Cole said, his voice flat and cold. He dismounted and turned his back on them, offering a hand to help June down from the wagon, a gesture of polite defiance that was not lost on anyone. June took his hand, her own trembling slightly. She met Violet's condescending gaze for a brief second, and in that moment, she was no longer a servant in the background. She was a woman who had ridden into town with Cole Ashford, and that made her a target. Inside the mercantile, Mei Lin greeted them with a slight, knowing nod, while Cole arranged to have his wagon unloaded. June approached the counter. "The telegraph," she said in a low voice. "The paper had your watermark." Mei Lin polished a glass jar with a clean rag, her movements deliberate. "The paper is one thing, the payment is another. A name in a ledger says more than 100 town gossips. June, find the name of the person who paid for the message." Her advice was a key, a clear path forward. The next stop was the telegraph office. The small building was next to the saloon, a nerve center of news and rumor. Eli Monroe was behind the counter, sorting through a stack of flimsies. He looked up when they entered, and a flicker of panic crossed his face before he quickly masked it. "Cole, Miss Harper," he mumbled, not quite meeting their eyes. "Terrible storm." "We are here about the telegram." "Eli," June said, her voice steady. She placed the dusty message on the counter. "The one you received from Cheyenne." "Right, that one," Eli said, shuffling his papers. "Came through yesterday morning. Just passed it along, like I'm supposed to. He was talking too fast." "We need to see the ledger," Cole said. His voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that made Eli flinch. "We need to see who paid for it." "The ledger?" "Oh, I do not know if I can do that. Regulations, you know, privacy." "Show us the book, Eli," Cole repeated, and this time it was not a request. As Eli reluctantly began to search for the ledger, June noticed a long, angry scratch on the back of her hand, a souvenir from the splintered wood she had wrestled with in the barn. It was beginning to ache. "I will be back," she said to Cole. "I am going to see Dr. Bell." Dr. Ada Bell's office was a small, clean room at the back of her modest house. She was a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and capable hands, an anomaly in the West, where medicine was almost exclusively a man's domain. She had earned the town's respect through competence and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Let me see," Dr. Bell said, taking June's hand. "That looks deep. You are lucky it is not infected," as she cleaned the wound with carbolic soap. She studied June's face. "You were at the Ashford Ranch during the storm." It was not a question. "Yes," June replied. "The whole town is buzzing about it," the doctor said, applying a neat bandage, like a hive full of angry bees. "You should know, June, that in a town like this, a reputation is as fragile as a bird's egg, and some people enjoy the sound it makes when it breaks." She finished tying the bandage and met June's eyes. A clean wound heals best. The same is true for a reputation. You have to expose the dirt before you can fix it. In that moment, June knew she had found an ally. That evening, in the back office of the Silver Comet boarding house, Harlan Garrett poured 2 glasses of whiskey. He pushed one across his desk to Sheriff Reed, a fleshy man whose authority was derived less from the law and more from his willingness to enforce Garrett's will. "The plan is working perfectly," Garrett said, his thin smile glinting in the lamplight. "Ashford brought the girl back to town, made a spectacle of himself. The whole town thinks he is a fool, ordering a bride and then parading her about. His pride must be taking a beating." Sheriff Reed took a long swallow of his whiskey. "What is the point of all this?" "Harlan, the telegram, the girl, it seems like a lot of trouble." "It is about pressure. Sheriff, the drought is coming. You can feel it in the air. The creeks are already low. Ashford Spring will be the only reliable water source for miles. He will not sell that land. But if we ruin his name, if we make him a laughingstock, if we heap enough trouble on him—" Garrett leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "He might be more willing to part with it for a reasonable price, just to have some peace. The girl is nothing. She is a crowbar to pry him loose from that land." "And the footprints your man left by the salt shed," Reed asked. "A little reminder that his property is not as secure as he thinks." "Keep him off balance. Keep the pressure on." Cole found Eli Monroe leaving the saloon, heading for the dark alley that ran behind it. The storm had cleared the air, and the first stars were appearing in the deep violet sky. "Eli?" Cole said, stepping out of the shadows. Eli jumped, spinning around. "Cole, I was just heading home." "You did not show me the ledger." Cole's voice was dangerously soft. "You told me you would look for it. You lied." "I got busy," Eli stammered, backing away. A lot of messages coming through after the storm. Cole closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, backing Eli against the rough plank wall of the saloon. He put a hand flat against the wood next to Eli's head, trapping him. "I have known you for 20 years. Eli, we rode together. We drank together. I thought you were my friend." Eli's face crumpled. "I am your friend. Cole, that is why I did it." Did what Cole's voice was a low growl. "Humiliate me, drag my name through the mud. For what?" "A few dollars." "No, not for that," Eli whispered, his eyes darting around the empty alley. He finally sagged against the wall, the fight going out of him. It was Garrett. He has had his thumb on June Harper for years. Works her to the bone, pays her next to nothing, whispers poison in her ear. "I have seen it. I wanted to get her out. I knew you were a good man, an honorable man. And I knew you were lonely, rattling around in that big house by yourself. I thought maybe I could solve 2 problems at once." The confession hung in the air, a strange mix of good intentions and deceit. "So you forged a telegram?" Cole asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes, and Garrett, he paid me," Eli admitted, his voice cracking. "He did not tell me what to write. He just said to cause some trouble for you, to stir the pot. He gave me $20. I used his money to send a message I thought would help you both." The betrayal was complete. Eli had tried to play both sides, to be a savior and a paid troublemaker at the same time. He had used June's desperation and Cole's honor as his playing pieces. The carefully constructed wall around Cole's emotions. The discipline he had cultivated for years. Finally shattered. He pulled his hand back from the wall, and in one swift, violent motion, he drove his fist into Eli's jaw. The sound was a sickening crack. Eli cried out and slumped to the ground, clutching his face. Cole stood over him, breathing heavily, his knuckles scraped and bleeding. He looked down at his own hand as if it belonged to a stranger. The loss of control terrified him more than the lie itself. "Cole, stop!" June's voice cut through his red-tinged anger. She was standing at the entrance to the alley, her face pale in the dim light, her newly bandaged hand held protectively in front of her. She walked forward slowly and stood between him and the man huddled on the ground. "This is what they want," she said, her voice quiet but firm, looking directly into his eyes. "Garrett, and whoever is with him, they want to drag you down into the dirt with them, to make you solve problems with your fists in a dark alley. Do not give them what they want." She reached out, not touching him, but her presence was a shield. "Let justice come by daylight." Her words, so simple and so true, doused the fire of his rage. He looked from her earnest face to Eli, who was sobbing quietly on the ground. She was right. This was the work of shadows. It had to be brought into the light. He took a step back, flexing his aching hand. As he did, a low, distant rumble echoed from the mountains to the east. A flash of lightning, too far away to be seen, illuminated the clouds for a barest instant. A storm was coming, the first real storm of the season. The thunder that had rumbled in the east was a liar. It came with no rain, a hollow promise that left the sky a pale, unforgiving sheet of blue. The days that followed grew hotter, the sun more relentless. The land baked and cracked. The grass in the pastures turned from brown to the brittle gray of ash. The town's well level dropped daily, and the water drawn from it came up tasting of mud and anxiety. The drought had tightened its grip, and all eyes, hungry and thirsty, turned to the green patch of land that was the Twin Spurs Ranch, where Cole Ashford's mountain spring still ran, a cool and steady pulse of life in a dying landscape. The whispers started in the saloon, as they always did, but this time they were not about a mail-order bride. Harlan Garrett made sure of that. He spoke in hushed, concerned tones to the men who drank his watered-down whiskey, his words spreading like a fever. "It is a shame about Ashford's salt mine," he would say, shaking his head with false sympathy. 3 men taken ill this week, just collapsed right there in the tunnels. They say it is the same sickness that took his brother." The rumor grew legs. It was a curse. Some said a darkness that had seeped into the ground after the accident that claimed young Samuel Ashford. The salt from the Twin Spurs was tainted with grief. It was bad luck. Sales of Cole's salt at the Mercantile dwindled and then stopped altogether. Ranchers who had relied on his salt blocks for their cattle began to make the long, expensive trip to the next county. Garrett's plan was working. He was isolating Cole, strangling his business, one whispered word at a time. June, who was now staying in a small, clean room at Dr. Bell's house, heard the rumors and felt a cold fury. She had seen the way Cole managed his small mining operation, the care he took with his workers. This was another lie, more potent and dangerous than the last. She went with Dr. Ada Bell to the mine entrance one afternoon. The 2 men on duty were sitting outside, their faces pale and fearful. One of them, a young man named Peterson, had been the latest to collapse. "It is a bad air, ma'am," he told Dr. Bell, his voice shaky. "You walk in a ways, and the lamp flickers low. You feel a heaviness in your chest, and your head starts to swim. It feels like a ghost is squeezing the life right out of you." Dr. Bell listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Show me." Despite the miners' protests, The two women took lanterns and walked into the cool darkness of the mine shaft. The air grew still and stale. After about 50 yards, the flame in Dr. Bell's lantern shrank, turning a sickly blue at its edges. June felt a wave of dizziness, a subtle pressure behind her eyes. "Stop," Dr. Bell said, her voice sharp and clear, though she held a handkerchief over her mouth. "It is not a ghost, June. It is bad air. The miners in the old country called it fire damp or choke damp, a gas, heavier than air. That settles in low places. It has no smell, but it will steal the breath from your lungs." She pointed to a section of the tunnel where there was no secondary ventilation shaft. "Cole's brother died in a cave not from this, but the gas has likely been seeping in slowly ever since. The drought is making it worse, somehow. Less groundwater to keep it sealed in the rock." They retreated to the fresh air. One of the miners, a man named George, had ignored their warnings and gone back in to fetch a misplaced pickaxe. As they stood discussing a way to dig a ventilation shaft, they heard a muffled cry from within the mine, followed by the clang of metal on rock. Without a word, June and the doctor tied their handkerchiefs over their faces, took a deep breath, and ran back into the tunnel. They found George slumped against the wall, his lantern extinguished at his feet. He was unconscious. He was a big man, and they could not move him. "The ventilation opening must be near the top of the tunnel," Dr. Bell gasped, the air already burning in her own lungs. "Help me find it." June's hands scrambled along the rough rock ceiling. She found a section that had been boarded over years ago, a forgotten air shaft, using a discarded pry bar. They tore at the boards, splinters digging into their hands. Finally, one board gave way, then another. A stream of fresh, clean air poured into the tunnel, a life-giving current that pushed the heavy, stagnant gas away from them. George sputtered and coughed, his eyelids fluttering. Between the two women and the now conscious Peterson, they managed to drag him out into the sunlight. The curse was broken, not by prayer, but by fresh air and common sense. The next day, Sheriff Reed paid a visit to the Twin Spurs Ranch. He found Cole replacing a fence post, his movements economical and powerful. June was there, handing him tools, having insisted on helping in return for Dr. Bell's hospitality. "Ashford," Reed said, not bothering to dismount from his horse, "the town council is concerned. The drought is getting worse. Your spring is a public asset in a time of emergency." "My spring is on my land." "Sheriff," Cole replied, not looking up from his work, "the deed is filed and the boundaries are clear." "There are old territorial statutes," Reed blustered, pulling a scroll of paper from his saddlebag. "Laws concerning the common good. In the event of a severe drought, a council can petition to assume control of a private water source to ensure the survival of the community." "You mean Harlan Garrett can petition?" Cole said, finally straightening up and fixing Reed with a level stare. "This has his fingerprints all over it." "This is for the good of the people of Drywater," Reed insisted, his face reddening. "You can cooperate and sell the water rights to the town for a fair price, or we can take it to a circuit judge. With the whole town thirsty, who do you think he will side with?" The threat was clear. They would use the law, twist it to their purpose, to take the most vital part of his land. Cole's hands tightened on the handle of the post driver. He looked out over his property, the land his father had settled, the land where his brother was buried. He would not surrender it. That evening, in the simple parlor of Dr. Bell's house, the three of them, Cole, June, and the doctor, held a council of their own. The doctor had confirmed that Reed's legal threat, while flimsy, was not entirely empty. A desperate judge could be swayed by public opinion. "They are using the town's fear against you," June said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "So, you must use their need, not as a weapon, but as a bridge." Cole looked at her, his expression questioning. "Do not let them take it," she continued, her voice filled with a quiet passion. "Make them ask for it. Open your gates. Let anyone who needs water come and take what they can carry for 3 days. Freely, no charge. Give it away, Cole asked, skepticism in his voice. Not give it away, she countered. In return, every person who takes water must sign a document, a legal statement, drawn up by a real lawyer, not a puppet sheriff. A statement that affirms they recognize the spring and the land it is on as the sole and permanent property of Cole Ashford. They would be trading a few buckets of water for a signature that protects you forever. No judge could ever rule against a document signed by the entire community. A slow smile spread across Dr. Adabel's face. That is brilliant. June, absolutely brilliant. Cole was silent for a long time, studying June's earnest face. She was not just a survivor. She was a strategist. She saw the world not just as it was, but as it could be manipulated for the cause of justice. He had never met anyone like her. He gave a single, decisive nod. The next morning, a notice was posted outside the Mercantile. For the next 3 days, the water at the Twin Spurs Ranch would be available to all. A lawyer from a neighboring town sat at a small table near the main gate, a freshly penned document and a bottle of ink before him. At first, only a few people came, suspicious and wary. But when they returned to town, their buckets full, the news spread like a wildfire. Soon, a long, snaking line of people with wagons, buckets, and barrels stretched from the ranch gate back toward Drywater. They were a portrait of the West ranchers in dusty hats, mothers with tired eyes and thirsty children, shopkeepers, and even a few of the saloon girls. Cole stood near the gate, directing the flow of traffic, his presence calm and commanding. June worked alongside him, offering dippers of cool water to those who had waited for hours in the blistering sun. She saw the looks on their faces change. Suspicion gave way to a grudging respect, which then softened into genuine gratitude. They were not seeing the reclusive miser from Garrett's rumors. They were seeing a neighbor, a man who, in their moment of greatest need, had opened his home to them, one by one. They signed the ledger, their signatures a testament to a new understanding. On the afternoon of the second day, Harlan Garrett watched the proceedings from a distance, his face a mask of cold fury. His plan was unraveling. He had tried to make Cole an enemy of the people, and June Harper's clever plan had turned him into their savior. He slipped away unnoticed and rode along the creek that flowed from Cole's spring. He found a place where a wooden sluice gate diverted a small portion of the water to a neighbor's hayfield. Working quickly with a heavy iron bar, he smashed the gate's locking mechanism and pried the wood loose, unleashing a surge of water. It was not enough to cause a major flood, but it was enough to swamp the hayfield, ruining the nearly harvested crop and turning the rich soil into a muddy bog. He smiled, a thin, cruel slash in his face, and rode away. Later that evening, as June was walking back to Dr. Bell's house, her body aching with exhaustion but her spirit soaring, a voice called to her from the shadows of the bank's porch. It was Violet LaRue. Quite the little heroine. Are not you, Violet said, her voice dripping with its usual sarcasm. But there was something else there, too, a flicker of something that was not entirely unkind. June simply nodded, too tired for a battle of wits. You should know, Violet continued, stepping closer, your victory party might be short-lived. There is to be a fundraising dance tomorrow night. For drought relief. How ironic. She paused, letting the words sink in. Sheriff Reed is going to make a speech. I overheard him talking to my father. He plans to make Mr. Ashford the star attraction, and not in a good way. She gave June a look that was a complex mixture of pity and challenge. If I were you, I would make sure I was there. The saloon was a world transformed. The usual smells of stale beer and regret had been temporarily banished by the scent of beeswax polish and the faint, sweet perfume of the town's women. Yellow lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm, forgiving glow that softened the room's hard edges. On a makeshift stage in the corner, a trio of musicians coaxed a lively tune from a fiddle, a banjo, and a guitar. and the floor was a swirling sea of calico and broadcloth. June stood near the doorway, a quiet island in the bustling current. She felt as though she were wearing a costume. The dress was a simple, dark blue cotton, one of her few possessions. But Mei Lin had spent an hour with her that afternoon, skillfully taking in the waist and adding a bit of lace to the collar, transforming it from a servant's garment into something quietly elegant. But it was the scarf around her neck that felt most like her own skin. It was a plain square of cloth, the color of the red desert earth, faded and soft from countless washings. It was her one small inheritance from her mother, a tangible piece of a life before the Silver Comet boarding house. Cole Ashford stood beside her. He looked as out of place as she felt. He wore a clean dark coat and trousers, but he could not disguise the fact that he was a man more at home under an open sky than a roof. He did not mingle. He did not smile at the greetings called to him. He stood with a quiet, unyielding stillness, his presence a silent declaration. He was here for a reason. He was here with her. They were the subject of every whispered conversation, every sidelong glance. The story of the water had earned Cole a measure of respect, but it had not erased the scandal of the telegram. Now, his public appearance with June was a fresh log on the fire of town gossip. As if on cue, Violet LaRue approached, a radiant vision in pale pink silk. She was flanked by two other young women, a trio of the town's most celebrated beauties. They moved with the confident grace of those who had never been told no. "Mr. Ashford," Violet purred, her smile dazzling. "You must be dreadfully bored, standing here by the door. The music is so lovely. Would you do me the honor of this dance?" Her friends giggled, their eyes flicking dismissively toward June. The challenge was unmistakable, a public test of his judgment. Choose the beautiful, wealthy banker's daughter, or stand by the plain, penniless servant. Cole's gaze did not waver from Violet's face. "That is a kind offer, Miss LaRue," he said, his voice polite but edged with steel. "But I am afraid I must decline. I have already promised the first dance." Violet's perfect smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Oh, and to whom?" she asked, her eyes sweeping the room, daring to find a woman who would claim such a prize. Cole's answer was not in words. He simply turned his head slightly and looked at June. It was a small movement, but it was as definitive as a signed contract. The color rose in Violet's cheeks, with a tight, angry little nod. She turned and swept away, her friends trailing in her wake like ruffled chicks. The music ended, followed by polite applause. Sheriff Reed, his face flushed with whiskey and self-importance, climbed onto the stage. He held up his hands for quiet. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice booming. "Thank you all for coming out tonight to support our little community in this time of need. This drought affects us all." He paused, letting his gaze roam over the crowd. He spoke of the damaged sluice gate, the ruined hay crop, framing it as a tragedy of incompetence, a careless act that had harmed a good man. His eyes settled on Cole. "It shows how careful we must be, how one man's actions can affect us all." He was laying the groundwork, planting the seeds of blame. Then his eyes slid from Cole to June, and a cruel, knowing smirk spread across his face. "But tonight is about hope," he continued, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "It is about new beginnings, even for those some might have thought were beyond hope." He gestured vaguely in June's direction. "You know, I have heard it said around this town for years, and I'm sure you have too. Everyone said she'd die alone." A wave of shocked, uncomfortable silence washed over the saloon. The words were a physical blow, a public stripping of her dignity. June felt every eye in the room turn to her, 100 points of pity and morbid curiosity. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to simply melt into the floorboards. Her hands clenched at her sides, and the room began to blur at the edges. But then, a movement broke the spell. Cole Ashford stepped away from the wall. He did not look at the sheriff. He did not look at the gawking crowd. He walked directly to June, his steps measured and certain. He stopped in front of her, and in the profound, ringing silence, he held out his hand. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the thick, judgmental air and reached every corner of the room. It was clear, steady, and filled with an unshakable conviction. Everyone said she'd die alone, he said, his eyes locked on hers, until I chose her over every beauty in town. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Jaws dropped. Violet LaRue's face was a mask of stunned disbelief. Harlan Garrett, watching from the bar, looked as if he had been struck. Sheriff Reed's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. June stared at Cole, at the strong, calloused hand he offered her. In his eyes, she did not see pity. She saw respect. She saw a partner. She saw an anchor in the storm. Slowly, as if in a dream, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and firm, as if on cue. The stunned musician struck up a new song, a slow, gentle waltz. Cole led her to the center of the floor. He placed one hand on the small of her back and kept her other hand firmly in his. They began to move, a solitary couple in the center of a sea of whispers. June had not danced in years, but she followed his lead effortlessly. They did not speak. There was no need for words. The world shrank to the circle of his arms. She was aware of the solid strength of his shoulder beneath her hand, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his stormy, gray eyes looked at her as if she were the only person in the room. He had not just defended her, he had claimed her, not as a possession, but as an equal, a chosen ally. In front of everyone, he had torn down his own walls of solitude and used the stones to build a fortress around her. When the music finally faded, they stood for a moment longer in the center of the floor. The applause was scattered at first, then grew stronger as respect and a sense of fairness overcame the initial shock. Cole led her from the floor, his hand never leaving hers. They needed air. They slipped out a side door onto the long covered porch that ran the length of the saloon. The night air was cool and smelled of dust and distant rain. As they stood there, a light, misty drizzle began to fall, pattering softly on the wooden roof above them. The sound was a gentle whisper, a balm after the noise and tension inside. "Thank you," June said, her voice barely audible over the rain. It was an inadequate word for what he had done. Cole turned to face her, his expression serious in the dim light spilling from the windows. "I only spoke the truth. June." He reached up and his thumb gently brushed a stray drop of moisture from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, yet sure. He looked at her, his gaze searching her face, and he saw not a servant, not a victim, but a woman of quiet strength and unwavering character. He saw the person who had stood with him in the storm, who had calmed his rage in the alley, who had devised the plan that had saved his land. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not move. His lips met hers, a soft, questioning pressure. It was not a kiss of fire and passion, but something far more profound. It was a kiss of gratitude, of recognition, of a shared solitude finally broken. It was sincere and reserved, a quiet sealing of the promise he had just made before the entire town. It ended as gently as it began. Inside the saloon, Sheriff Reed, his face a mottled purple of rage and humiliation, shoved his way through the crowd. He cornered Harlan Garrett by the bar. "This changes nothing," Reed hissed, his voice low and vicious. "The complaint about the flood has been filed. The damage is real. Tomorrow morning, I am signing the warrant for his arrest." The sun rose with a vengeance, as if to reclaim the sky after the previous night's brief shower. Sheriff Reed did not wait for the town to be fully awake. He arrived at Dr. Bell's house with a single, nervous-looking deputy, just as the first birds were starting to sing. They did not knock. Reed pounded on the door with the butt of his pistol. June was already in the kitchen, preparing coffee. She opened the door to find Reed standing there, a warrant in his hand and a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Cole Ashford," he announced, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "I have a warrant for your arrest, for willful destruction of property and endangering the public welfare." Cole appeared in the hallway behind June. Fully dressed, he had not been sleeping. He looked at the warrant, then at the sheriff's triumphant face, and his own expression remained one of profound, unshakable calm. "There is no need to shout. Sheriff," he said quietly, "I will come with you." Dr. Bell came out, tying her robe, her eyes blazing with indignation. "This is an outrage. Reed, you know he did nothing wrong. The law will decide that." "Doctor," Reed snapped. "He is to be transported to the county seat for trial." He gestured with his head to the deputy. "Cuff him." "That will not be necessary," Cole said, holding out his hands. The deputy, a young man who looked deeply uncomfortable, reluctantly snapped the metal cuffs over Cole's wrists. June watched, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This was not about justice. It was a public spectacle, a humiliation designed by Harlan Garrett. As Reed marched Cole out to a waiting wagon, little Tom came running from the direction of the livery stable, his face pale with panic. He had been sent to check on Cole's horse. "Cole!" the boy cried, his voice breaking. Cole stopped and looked down at him. "You stay with Dr. Bell. Tom, you listen to what she says. Look after the ranch until I get back." He spoke with such quiet certainty that it sounded less like a hope and more like a simple statement of fact. Then he was prodded into the back of the wagon. Reed and the deputy mounted their horses, and the small procession started its journey. Not west toward the county seat's main road, but north toward the higher, less traveled mountain pass. It was the longer route, but Reed had clearly chosen it to avoid the gratitude of the ranchers Cole had just saved. As they disappeared from view, a strange, unseasonable wind began to blow from the north. It was a cold wind, a wind that carried the scent of pine in high, lonely places. It made the hairs on June's arms stand up. By midday, the sky had turned the color of slate, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. The familiar, baking heat of the drought was gone, replaced by a damp, penetrating chill that felt profoundly unnatural for June. Dr. Bell stood on her porch, staring at the bruised-looking clouds that were gathering over the mountains. "This is not right," she murmured, more to herself than to June. "I have seen it happen once before, years ago. A pocket of Arctic air, pushed south by some freak current. In the high country, that means snow." June looked at the mountains, a dark, menacing wall against the gray sky. Cole was up there, in an open wagon, with no shelter. The cold she felt was suddenly more than the wind. It was fear. "They will be trapped," she said. "Worse," the doctor replied, her face grim. "If the temperature keeps dropping, they will freeze." Reed, in his arrogance, took the high pass. He has ridden straight into a trap of his own making. A decision formed in June's mind, solid and clear. She would not wait. She would not stand by while the man who had defended her was left to the mercy of the elements and his enemies. "Tom," she said, turning to the boy who was huddled on the steps, his eyes still fixed on the empty road. "Do you know the old trapper's trail that cuts across that pass?" Tom nodded, his eyes lighting with purpose. "I can follow their tracks." "Then we are going after them," June declared. They worked with a silent, desperate urgency. Dr. Bell, her scientific mind assessing the medical risks, packed a bag with bandages, salves, and a precious bottle of laudanum. She added a flask of brandy. "For shock," she explained. June gathered every spare blanket in the house, along with bread, dried beef, and a tin of coffee. Tom, his fear replaced by a fierce determination, went to the livery and returned with 3 sturdy horses, including Cole's buckskin, which followed the boy with a trusting obedience. Their journey upward was a race against the dying light and the plummeting temperature. The trapper's trail was a faint scar on the mountainside, but Tom followed it with an unerring instinct, his eyes scanning the ground for the tracks of the wagon and the two riders. The rain began an hour into their climb, a cold, sleeting downpour that soaked them to the bone. Then, as they gained elevation, the sleet turned to snow. At first it was just wet, heavy flakes melting as they landed. But soon, the flakes grew smaller and harder. Driven by a howling wind that shrieked through the pines, the world became a swirling vortex of white. They found the wagon just before dusk. It was stuck fast in a snowdrift that had filled a deep ravine. One wheel splintered against a hidden rock. The mules stood with their heads lowered, their backs white with snow. The deputy was trying to calm them, his face a mask of misery. Of Sheriff Reed, there was no sign. Cole was sitting in the back of the wagon, his hands still cuffed in front of him. He was covered in a dusting of snow, but his face was a study in calm endurance. When he saw them, a flicker of profound relief crossed his face before he mastered it. "June," he said, his voice hoarse from the cold, "you should not be here." "Where is Reed?" Dr. Bell demanded, her voice sharp above the wind. The deputy pointed a trembling, numb finger further up the trail. He went for help, said he knew a line shack somewhere up ahead. That was an hour ago. He never came back. Panic was a wild animal in the deputy's eyes. June looked at Cole, then up the trail into the blinding snow. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that Reed was in serious trouble. "Tom, you stay with the horses," she commanded. "Dr. Bell, you see to the deputy. Cole, can you walk?" He nodded. The deputy, spurred to action, fumbled with the key and unlocked Cole's cuffs. The moment he was free, Cole was on his feet, chafing his wrists to restore circulation, his focus absolute. He took one of the blankets and wrapped it around the still trembling deputy. "I will go," he said to June. "I will find him." "We will both go," she said, her chin set. They moved up the trail, two solitary figures against the storm's fury, calling Reed's name. The snow was knee-deep now, and the wind cut like a razor. They found him less than 100 yards away. He had slipped on an icy rock and fallen, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He was lying half-conscious in the snow, his face a ghastly shade of blue, his breathing shallow and ragged. Cole knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. "It is weak," he said. June put her ear close to Reed's mouth. The puffs of air were faint and irregular. She looked at the man who had publicly humiliated her, the man who had arrested his rival on false charges. He was helpless now, a broken thing at their mercy. She could focus on Cole, get him to shelter, and leave Reed to the fate he had arguably earned. It was a choice. But for June, it was not a choice at all. "Help me turn him onto his back," she said to Cole. She tilted Reed's head back to clear his airway. She had seen a traveling doctor do this once for a man who had choked in the boarding house dining room. She remembered the frantic, rhythmic movements. She placed the heel of one hand on the center of his chest, covered it with the other, and began to push down, hard and fast, trying to force the life back into his failing body. She paused, pinched his nose, and covering his mouth with hers, she breathed her own warm air into his lungs. Once, twice, then she went back to pressing on his chest. It was a desperate, exhausting rhythm in the heart of the blizzard. After what felt like an eternity, Reed gave a great, shuddering gasp. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and wild with fear. He was alive. Between them, they managed to get him to his feet, his arms slung over Cole's broad shoulders. They half-carried, half-dragged him up the trail until they found it a small, dilapidated line shack. Barely more than a hovel, but it had 4 walls and a semblance of a roof. It was shelter. It was survival. Inside, it was dark and smelled of mice and old rot, but it was out of the wind. Little Tom, a small, determined hero, had managed to lead the horses up, and Dr. Bell and the deputy arrived a few minutes later. They built a small, smoky fire in the crumbling stone hearth. They huddled together in the cramped space, wrapped in the wet, scratchy blankets, sharing the last of the bread and the doctor's brandy. Dr. Bell set Reed's leg, the sheriff biting down on a piece of leather to stifle his cries. As the night wore on and the storm raged outside, a fragile peace settled within the shack. The deputy and Tom fell into an exhausted sleep. The doctor dozed fitfully, her medical bag clutched in her lap. Reed was quiet, his pain dulled by brandy and laudanum. Cole and June sat close to the fire, their shoulders almost touching, their breath misting in the cold air. "You saved his life," Cole said, his voice low. He was looking at her with an expression of awe. "The man who came to destroy you." "I saved a man," she corrected quietly. "That is all." In that moment, he was not the sheriff. He was just a life that needed saving. She looked into the flames. "I have been afraid my whole life. Cole, afraid of being poor, of being alone, of being worthless. But up there, in the snow, I was not afraid. I just knew what had to be done." He was silent for a long moment. "I have been afraid, too," he admitted, the words costing him a great deal. "After my brother died, I walled myself in. I thought if I did not let anyone get close, I could not lose anyone again. I thought it was strength, but it was just a different kind of prison." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You have more courage in your little finger than a man like Reed has in his whole body. June." He reached out and took her hand. It was not the brief, hesitant touch of the night before. His fingers laced with hers, a firm, steady anchor in the wild night. And there, in the heart of a freak summer blizzard, huddled in a ruined shack, they did not talk of love. They spoke of fear and of courage. And in that shared honesty, they laid a foundation of trust stronger than any stone. The morning dawned bright and shockingly clear. The sun hit the snow-covered landscape with a dazzling intensity. And with the sun came the warmth. The freak storm vanished as quickly as it had arrived. By mid-morning, the snow was melting in great, slushy rivers, and the trail was passable once more. Their return to dry water was a sight the town would not soon forget. The rescue party rode in, not as fugitives and vigilantes, but as heroes. In the lead was Cole Ashford, a free man. Behind him, the deputy led a horse carrying a pale and humbled Sheriff Reed, his legs splinted, his arrogance washed away by the storm. The entire town saw it. They saw who had panicked and who had persevered. They saw who had acted with malice and who had acted with grace. Reed, weak and in no position to argue, officially released Cole from custody. The charges were dropped. Harlan Garrett watched from the window of the Silver Comet, his face a thundercloud of black fury. His puppet was broken, his scheme was in ruins, and Cole Ashford was more respected than ever. Later that afternoon, back at the Twin Spurs, Cole was checking his property for damage. The ranch had been spared the worst of the snow. As he walked by the salt shed, something caught his eye, near the foundation, where the melting snow had washed away a layer of dust, lay a small, dark object. It was a book of matches, the cover sodden and warped. A few feet away, half hidden under a bush, was a discarded oil can. He picked it up and sniffed the spout. Kerosene. The matches were too wet to have ever been struck. The storm that had nearly killed him had also, it seemed, saved his life's work. The night came down without a moon. A thick, smothering blanket of black. A hot, dry wind kicked up, rattling windows and scuttling dust and leaves down the empty streets of Drywater. It was a nervous wind. A wind that carried the scent of arson. At the Twin Spurs Ranch, it moaned around the corners of the salt shed, a low, predatory sound. Inside the ranch house, June was mending a tear in one of Little Tom's shirts by the light of a single lantern. Cole sat at the table across from her, cleaning a rifle. The rhythmic, metallic scrape of the cleaning rod a steady counterpoint to the howling wind. A comfortable silence had grown between them, a quiet understanding that needed no words. But tonight, the silence felt different. It was taut, expectant. It was little Tom who smelled it first. He came into the main room from his small bedroom, his nose twitching. "Something's burning," he said, his voice small and worried. Cole was on his feet in an instant, the rifle forgotten. He threw open the door, and the wind tore into the room, bringing with it the unmistakable, terrifying smell of smoke and kerosene. A hellish orange glow was beginning to pulse against the far wall of the salt shed. "Tom, stay in the house and lock the door," Cole commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. He was already running, grabbing 2 empty buckets as he went. June did not hesitate. She followed him out into the roaring dark, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The fire was not large yet, but the wind was fanning it, pushing the flames toward the shed's main wooden structure. They saw a figure, a man hired by Garrett, scrambling away into the darkness. There was no time to give chase. They worked with a desperate, synchronized fury. Cole used the hand pump, his muscles straining as he forced a pathetic stream of water from the well. June filled the buckets, her arms screaming with the effort, and ran, throwing the water at the base of the flames. It was like trying to put out a bonfire with a teaspoon. The fire hissed and spat, momentarily retreating before leaping forward again, angrier than before. "It is not enough," Cole gasped, his face grim in the flickering firelight. "Ring the bell, June! Ring it loud!" June ran to the large iron bell that hung from a post near the house. The bell used to call the hands in from the far pastures. She pulled on the thick rope with all her might. The deep, clanging alarm notes tore through the night, a desperate plea for help sent out into the empty, wind-swept darkness. For what felt like an eternity, there was no answer. It was just the two of them, the roaring wind and the growing fire. Then, a light appeared on the road from town, then another and another. A wagon, then men on horseback. Then men on foot, running. The sound of the bell had reached them. The people of Drywater were coming. Dr. Ada Bell was the first to arrive, her buggy bouncing over the rough track, little Tom beside her. She had ignored Cole's command and had gone straight to the doctor's house for help. She took in the scene with a single, practiced glance. "The smoke is as dangerous as the fire," she yelled, her voice carrying over the din. "That mine still seeps gas. A spark inside, and the whole thing will go up. Wet cloths over your faces. Everyone." She began directing the arriving townsfolk, turning them into an efficient firefighting brigade. Men formed a bucket line from the pump to the fire. Others, led by the doctor, soaked horse blankets in the water trough and began beating at the edges of the flames. Inside the shed, 3 of Cole's miners, who lived in a small bunkhouse nearby, had been trapped by the smoke while trying to save some of the equipment. Dr. Bell, her own face covered, led 2 men into the choking blackness and emerged moments later, helping the gasping, half-conscious miners into the fresh air. Just as the bucket brigade began to make headway, another wagon clattered into the yard. It was May Lynn, her face set in a grim line. She was holding a large, leather-bound ledger. At the same time, a figure stumbled out of the darkness on foot, his face pale and slick with sweat. It was Eli Monroe. He, too, was clutching a ledger. The 2 unlikely allies, the pragmatic shopkeeper and the guilt-ridden telegraph operator, had come to the light with their books of truth. The fire was beginning to subside, beaten back by the determined, communal effort. The immediate danger was passing, and in that moment, as the townsfolk stood catching their breath, their face smudged with soot, Sheriff Reed rode into the firelight, Harlan Garrett at his side. Reed's leg was splinted, and he sat his horse awkwardly. He had clearly been summoned by Garrett to reassert control. "What is going on here?" Reed bellowed, trying to project an authority he no longer possessed. "An illegal assembly. There has been an attempt to burn down Mr. Ashford's property." "Sheriff," Mei Lin said, her voice clear and cutting. She held up her ledger. "And I believe you will be interested to see who purchased a large can of kerosene on credit this afternoon. The signature in my book says it was delivered to you." A low murmur went through the crowd. Before Reed could respond, Eli Monroe stepped forward, his own book held out like a shield. "And I have the Telegraph ledger," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "It shows a payment of $20, made by Harlan Garrett to me, to spread lies and cause trouble for Mr. Ashford." The truth was out, laid bare in the flickering light of the dying fire. The crowd turned as one, their faces a mixture of anger and betrayal, looking from the ledgers to Garrett and Reed. The two men were trapped, exposed. Reed's face, already pale, turned ashen. His hand went to the pistol at his hip. He drew the weapon, his movements clumsy and panicked, and leveled it at Cole. "Stay back," he snarled. "All of you." Without a single thought for her own safety, June stepped directly in front of Cole, shielding his body with her own. She stood between the gun and the man she would not let them harm. Her small, determined figure was an unshakable wall. The scene descended into chaos. In that moment of distraction, Garrett, his face a mask of feral desperation, lunged sideways. He grabbed little Tom, who had been standing near Dr. Bell, and yanked the boy in front of him, clamping a hand over his mouth. "Drop the gun! Reed! You fool!" Garrett shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Everyone, back away, or the boy gets hurt!" The crowd froze, horrified. Cole's face went rigid with a cold, terrifying fury. He looked at the boy he considered a son, held hostage by the man who had systematically tried to destroy him. "Let him go, Garrett," Cole said, his voice dangerously low. "This is between you and me." He took a step forward, away from the protection of June's body. He raised his hands slowly to show they were empty. "Let the boy go, and I will go with you. Whatever you want." It was a standoff, a terrible tableau of good versus evil. But then, two things happened at once. Dr. Ada Bell, standing near the entrance to the salt shed, caught June's eye. She nodded toward one of the powerful mining lanterns, its reflector shield polished to a mirror shine. June understood instantly. As the doctor discreetly lit the lamp, June moved slowly, circling around the edge of the confrontation. At the same time, Eli Monroe, seeing his chance while all eyes were on Garrett, began to creep up behind the still-armed Sheriff Reed. "Now," Dr. Bell mouthed. She and June swung the heavy lamp up, aiming the brilliant, focused beam of light directly into Harlan Garrett's face. He cried out, momentarily blinded, his grip on Tom loosening. In that same instant, Eli launched himself at Reed's back, knocking the sheriff's gun arm wide. Garrett, disoriented and enraged, stumbled backward, releasing Tom. He raised his own small pistol, which had been concealed in his coat, and fired wildly into the crowd, a final, spiteful act of chaos. A single shot rang out. A searing pain tore through Cole's left shoulder. He staggered back, a look of shock on his face, his hand flying to the wound. June screamed his name. She was at his side in a second, ripping the red scarf from her neck. She pressed the folded cloth hard against the bleeding wound, her movements deft and sure, her mind clear and focused despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "Hold this," she commanded a stunned bystander, showing him how to maintain pressure. She looked up at the crowd, at the shocked faces, and her voice, the voice of a quiet servant, rang out with the authority of a general. "Do not let them get away," she cried. "Stop them, now!" Her words broke the spell of fear. The crowd surged forward, a wave of righteous anger. They surrounded Garrett and Reed, who were quickly disarmed and subdued. The fire was out. The truth was revealed, and the two architects of the town's misery were bound and held, their reign of whispers and intimidation finally at an end. The whole town had seen it all. The salt shed, scarred but standing, was safe. The circuit judge, a man named Elias Thorne with a face as weathered as an old law book, arrived in Drywater 2 days later. He did not convene his court in the saloon or the sheriff's office, both now tainted by their association with the accused. Instead, he set up a long trestle table on the covered porch of the Mercantile, in the open air, where all of Drywater could see and hear. The entire town gathered, a silent, sober audience standing in the dust of the main street. Harlan Garrett and a sullen, broken Sheriff Reed stood before the judge, their hands bound. They offered no defense, only a series of blustering denials that withered under the weight of the evidence presented against them. The proceedings were swift and sure, a cleansing of a wound that had festered for too long. May Lynn was the first to testify. She presented her sales ledger, the pages crisp and orderly. She pointed to the entry for the can of kerosene, the spidery signature of the man Garrett had hired clear for all to see, with a note authorizing the bill to be sent to the sheriff's office. It was a simple, irrefutable fact of commerce that became a nail in Garrett's coffin. Next came Eli Monroe. He was trembling, but his voice was clear as he spoke. He told the story of the $20 payment, of Garrett's instruction to stir the pot. He presented his own telegraph ledger, showing the transaction, a record of the bribe that had set the entire tragedy in motion. He confessed his own misguided attempt to help June, his shame a palpable thing in the quiet morning air. He did not ask for forgiveness, only to tell the truth. Then Dr. Ada Bell took her turn. In a clear, scientific voice, she explained the nature of the gas in the mine, debunking the superstitious rumors of a curse with the simple facts of geology and chemistry. She described how the smoke from the fire, combined with that gas, would have been lethal to the men trapped inside the shed, turning an act of arson into a clear case of attempted murder. Her testimony was a cool breeze of logic that blew away the last remaining shadows of Garrett's manipulative whispers. The people of the town, who had stood on the front lines of the fire, who had seen Garrett take a child hostage, who had watched June Harper stand in front of a loaded gun to protect Cole Ashford, needed no more convincing. Their stony, accusatory silence was a verdict in itself. Judge Thorne made it official. Reed was stripped of his badge and sentenced to 10 years of hard labor for corruption and complicity. For Harlan Garrett. The sentence was 20 years for attempted murder, arson, fraud, and a litany of other crimes. As they were led away in chains to a prison wagon, not a single person in Drywater looked at them with anything but contempt. The reign of whispers was over. In the quiet days that followed, the rhythm of life at the Twin Spurs Ranch found a new, gentle cadence. Cole's shoulder was healing, the bullet having passed clean through without hitting bone, a fact for which Dr. Bell was profoundly grateful. But the injury left him weak and forced him into a state of stillness that was unnatural for him. It was June who became his anchor. Their intimacy was not built on grand declarations, but on 1,000 small, unspoken gestures. It was in the way she learned to brew his coffee, strong and black, and have a cup waiting for him when he woke. It was in the quiet competence of her hands as she changed his bandage each morning, her touch gentle but firm. It was in the long afternoons they spent on the porch, he in a sturdy rocking chair, she mending clothes, reading to him from one of his books, or simply sitting in a comfortable silence that felt more fulfilling than any conversation. She helped him with the slow, painful exercises Dr. Bell prescribed, her steady presence giving him the strength to push through the pain. Cole, a man who had prided himself on his complete self-reliance, found himself learning the difficult, humbling, and ultimately healing lesson of how to depend on another. He watched her move about his house, bringing with her a quiet light and order, and realized with a startling clarity that the house had never truly felt like a home until she was in it. One morning, a week after the trial, they saw a strange sight. A slow procession of wagons and riders was making its way up the road to the ranch. It was not a mob this time. It was a delegation. The same people who had come for water a week earlier were returning. a rancher named Peterson, the same man who had first taunted Cole about the telegram in the Mercantile, acted as their spokesman. "Mr. Ashford," he said, his hat held respectfully in his hands. We came to pay for the water." Cole, his arm in a sling, stood on the porch, with June beside him. "The water was a gift," he said. "No, sir," Peterson insisted. "It was not. It was a neighborly act, and we aim to be neighborly back." He gestured to the wagons, which were loaded with sacks of flour, tools, bolts of cloth, and sides of bacon. "We do not have much cash, but we brought what we have, a trade, for the water, and for everything else." Then, one by one, they came forward, not just with their goods, but with their pens. They voluntarily signed the legal document the lawyer had drawn up, the one June had devised. They signed it not out of desperation, but out of respect. It was their apology, their pledge of allegiance, their final, definitive rejection of Garrett's poison. Cole's ownership of his land and his water was now protected by something stronger than any deed or law. It was protected by the goodwill of his entire community. That evening, the sky, which had been a harsh, cloudless blue for weeks, began to soften. Gray clouds gathered over the mountains, heavy and promising. A gentle, steady rain began to fall. It was not a violent storm, but a cleansing shower, washing the layers of dust from the thirsty land. The scent of wet earth and sagebrush filled the air. Cole and June stood on the covered porch, watching the rain fall, listening to its soothing rhythm on the wooden roof. The world seemed new, scrubbed clean. Cole turned to her. He held something in his good hand. It was a pair of silver spurs, intricately carved, the rowels shaped like tiny stars. They were the spurs he wore only on special occasions, the spurs that had given his ranch its name. They were his symbol, a representation of his heritage and his responsibility. He did not kneel. He did not have a speech prepared. He simply looked at her, his heart in his eyes, and held them out. "The West has taught me two things," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble, "how to tie a strong knot, and that choosing someone to trust is a knot that must hold forever." He gently placed the twin spurs in her hands. Their weight was cool and solid. "If you will wear these, June, then this place is your home." Tears welled in June's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of a deep, quiet joy that she had never known was possible. She looked from the silver spurs in her hands to the face of the man who had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. She curled her fingers around the cool metal. It was her acceptance. They began to make plans, not just for themselves, but for the community they had helped to heal. They would build a small schoolhouse on a corner of the ranch property, a place where little Tom and the other children from the outlying ranches could learn to read and write. They offered Dr. Ada Bell a plot of land to build a proper clinic, a place of healing for the whole territory. Eli Monroe, humbled and eager to make amends, asked to stay on as a ranch hand. His quiet, diligent work, a constant act of penance and gratitude. The rain fell all through the night. In the morning, the world was alive with color. On the hillsides, where everything had been brown and brittle, the first purple blossoms of wild columbine were pushing up through the damp earth, a testament to the stubborn resilience of hope. June stood on the porch, a clean, freshly washed red scarf tied around her neck. She looked out at the greening land, at the home she had found, at the man standing beside her, and she whispered to the clean, morning air, "No one dies alone when they choose to stand together." Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.